It had been one of those long days where everything seemed to go wrong. Work was a mess, the kids were cranky, and the idea of cooking dinner felt like climbing a mountain. I'd ordered food from a new delivery app without a second thought, relieved to let someone else handle at least one part of my chaotic evening. When the doorbell rang, I wasn't prepared for who would be standing on the other side. It was Chris. I hadn't seen him in nearly a decade, not since the messy breakup that had ended our relationship and sent us in completely different directions. He was the first real boyfriend I'd ever had, the one I thought I'd marry, before life intervened and we realized we weren't meant to be. For a moment, we both froze, staring at each other in stunned silence. "Caroline," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "Chris," I replied, equally shocked. "What are you doing here?" His delivery bag slung over his shoulder answered the question, but it didn't explain why my heart suddenly felt like it was beating out of my chest. "Small world," he said with a nervous laugh, handing me the bag of food. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." "Neither did I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The exchange should have ended there. I should have taken the food, closed the door, and gone back to my family. But something about seeing him again threw me completely off balance. Before I knew it, we were standing in the doorway, catching up on the basics, where life had taken us, how we'd ended up here. I told him about my husband, James, and our 2 kids. He mentioned that he'd moved back to town recently and was trying to get back on his feet after a rough couple of years. There was a familiarity in the way we talked, like no time had passed. It was unsettling and comforting all at once. I don't know what possessed me to say it. Maybe it was nostalgia, or the fact that I hadn't felt this scene in years. Or maybe it was just a moment of weakness after a long, exhausting day. "Do you want to come in for a bit?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Chris hesitated, glancing down at the bag still slung over his shoulder. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said. "You're probably right," I replied quickly, feeling the weight of what I'd just suggested. But he didn't leave. He stood there for a moment longer, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between us, a flicker of the connection we'd once shared, ignited by the sheer improbability of this reunion. I didn't see Chris again that evening. He left with a polite goodbye, and I shut the door, my heart racing as I tried to process what had just happened. But the memory of his face lingered, resurfacing as I sat with James and the kids at the dinner table, pretending everything was normal. James didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, too engrossed in helping our youngest navigate a particularly tricky puzzle. But I felt like I was on the edge of something dangerous, and I couldn't explain why. I told myself that running into Chris was nothing more than a strange coincidence, a random event in a life filled with routines and responsibilities. But the truth was, it had stirred something in me, memories I hadn't thought about in years, emotions I thought I'd buried. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about him more than I wanted to admit. I wondered what he was doing, whether he thought about our brief encounter, whether he missed the life we'd once dreamed of having together. It was ridiculous, of course. I had a husband, a family, a life I loved. I wasn't the kind of person who entertained these thoughts. Or at least, I hadn't been until now. A week later, I ordered delivery again, this time from a different restaurant. I wasn't thinking about Chris when I placed the order, I wasn't trying to orchestrate another meeting. But when the doorbell rang, there he was again, standing on my porch like a ghost from the past. "This is getting weird," he said with a laugh, holding up the bag. "Yeah, it is," I agreed, trying to ignore the way my heart skipped a beat. We talked for a few minutes, the conversation light and easy, but there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. The next time I saw Chris, it wasn't by chance. I texted him. I don't know why I did it, or what I hoped to accomplish, but I told myself it was harmless, a way to catch up with someone who had once meant a lot to me. We met for coffee, and it felt like stepping into a time machine. We laughed, reminisced, and talked about the paths our lives had taken. But beneath the surface, there was something else, a pull I hadn't felt in years, a spark I thought had long since burned out. And then, before I could stop it, I crossed a line I never thought I'd cross. The morning after, I woke up feeling like I'd stepped into a nightmare. The memory of what had happened with Chris played over and over in my mind, each replay sharper and more suffocating than the last. It wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't that person. I wasn't someone who betrayed the trust of the person who loved me, who counted on me. James was downstairs with the kids, their laughter mixing with the sound of the cartoons they watched every Saturday morning. The normalcy of it all felt like a cruel joke, like the world had gone on as if nothing had changed, while I felt like I was falling apart. I stayed in bed longer than usual, trying to compose myself, but the moment I walked downstairs and saw James standing at the stove making pancakes, the guilt hit me like a tidal wave. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said, smiling as he flipped a pancake. "I was starting to think you'd sleep through breakfast." "Rough night," I mumbled, avoiding his eyes. James didn't press further, too preoccupied with wrangling the kids and making sure the pancakes didn't burn. He was always so steady, so dependable. And I had shattered everything. As the day went on, I replayed every moment of the night before, trying to understand how it had happened. I hadn't planned to see Chris again after that coffee meeting. I hadn't planned for anything to happen at all. But when I'd received his text, asking if I wanted to meet up again, I didn't hesitate. I told myself it was just nostalgia, that I wanted closure. The restaurant where we met was small and dimly lit, a quiet place where we could talk without interruptions. At first, the conversation was harmless, just two people catching up on old times. But as the night went on, the barriers between us began to crumble. I don't know who leaned in first, but the moment it happened, I felt like I was free-falling. Now, in the light of day, the reality of my actions was unbearable. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, like I'd betrayed not just James, but myself. I tried to act normal, going through the motions of our usual Saturday routine, but every smile I gave James, every hug I gave the kids, felt like a lie. That evening, after the kids were in bed and James was in the living room watching TV, my phone buzzed. It was Chris. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting in knots. I didn't want to answer, but I knew ignoring him wouldn't make the situation go away. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hey," he said, his tone cautious. I wanted to see how you're doing." "I'm fine," I said quickly. "We shouldn't be talking." "I know," he said, his voice softening. I can't stop thinking about you." His words sent a pang through my chest, but they also filled me with anger, at him, at myself, at the situation we'd created. "This was a mistake," I said firmly. "It can't happen again." There was a long pause before he replied. "I understand," he said finally. "But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." Over the next few days, I tried to bury myself in the routines of family life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that James could sense something was wrong. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. He nodded, but the concern in his eyes lingered. Desperate for clarity, I called my best friend, Mia. We met at a quiet park, where I poured out the whole story, how Chris had re-entered my life, how I'd let myself get caught up in something I couldn't explain. Mia listened without interrupting, her expression a mix of shock and concern. "Caroline," she said finally, "you need to figure out what you're going to do. You can't keep this a secret forever." "I know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But if I tell James, it'll destroy everything." "And if you don't?" she asked gently. Her question hung in the air, a weight I couldn't ignore. That night, as I lay in bed next to James, I knew Mia was right. I couldn't keep living like this, carrying the guilt of what I'd done while pretending everything was fine. But the thought of confessing, of seeing the hurt in James's eyes, was almost too much to bear. As I stared at the ceiling, I whispered a silent prayer for guidance, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The weight of my secret was becoming unbearable. Every day, I felt myself unraveling a little more. James's kindness, his trust, his unwavering presence, it all made the guilt heavier. The lie between us grew louder in my head, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to tell him. It was a Tuesday evening, one of those rare nights where the kids went to bed early and the house was quiet. James was in the kitchen, rinsing the dishes from dinner, humming softly to himself. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. "James," I said, my voice barely audible. He looked up, a smile playing on his lips. "What's up?" I hesitated, every part of me screaming to turn back, to bury this forever. But I couldn't live with the lie any longer. "We need to talk," I said, stepping into the room. He set the dish down, his expression shifting to concern. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "I made a mistake," I said, my voice trembling. "A big mistake." He frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" I couldn't meet his eyes. "You remember the delivery guy, the one who came by a few weeks ago? He's someone I used to know. Someone I used to date." James's brow furrowed, but he stayed silent, waiting for me to continue. "I ran into him again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I let things go too far. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I crossed a line I never should have crossed." For a moment, James didn't say anything. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "How far did it go?" I swallowed hard, tears streaming down my face. "I kissed him," I admitted. "It was a mistake, and I regret it more than anything. I love you, James. I love our family. I never wanted to hurt you." His face was a mix of shock, anger, and pain. "I don't even know what to say," he said finally. "How could you do this?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I was stupid. I wasn't thinking. But it didn't mean anything. It's over. I promise you, it's over." The next few days were a blur of tension and distance. James didn't yell, didn't lash out. Instead, he withdrew, retreating into himself in a way I'd never seen before. He slept on the couch, his presence in the house reduced to the bare minimum required to keep things functioning for the kids. I tried to give him space, but every second of his silence felt like a knife twisting in my chest. On the third night, he finally broke the silence. We were sitting on opposite ends of the living room, the air between us thick with unspoken words. "Why didn't you tell me about him when he first showed up?" he asked, his voice cold but calm. "I was scared," I admitted. "Scared of how it might look, scared of what it might mean. And I didn't think it would matter. I didn't think I'd see him again." James nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You should have told me," he said. "Maybe if you had, this wouldn't have happened." "I know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it." Through it all, the kids remained blissfully unaware of what was happening. They still laughed, played, and asked for bedtime stories as if nothing had changed. Their innocence was both a blessing and a painful reminder of what was at stake. Desperate to save our marriage, I suggested counseling. At first, James was resistant. "Why should I sit in a room and talk about this with a stranger?" he asked bitterly. "Because we need help," I said. "I can't fix this alone. And I don't want to lose you." After several days of silence, he finally agreed. Walking into the therapist's office was nerve-wracking. James and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling like miles. The therapist, a kind but no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel, began by asking us to share why we were there. I'm here because my wife betrayed me, James said bluntly. And I'm here because I made a terrible mistake, I added, my voice trembling. And I want to make things right. Dr. Patel nodded, her gaze steady. Infidelity is one of the hardest things a relationship can face, she said. But healing is possible. It will take time, honesty, and a willingness to confront some uncomfortable truths. Over the next few sessions, James and I began to unpack the layers of what had happened. He expressed his anger, his hurt, and his feelings of betrayal. I listened, apologizing again and again, knowing that words alone could never be enough. Dr. Patel encouraged us to focus on small steps, honest conversations, moments of connection, and finding ways to rebuild trust. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, James and I sat in the kitchen, sipping tea in silence. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said finally. But I'm willing to try. For us. For the kids. His words felt like a lifeline, a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. After James said he was willing to try, I felt a weight lift from my chest, but I knew it was just the beginning. His words were a fragile lifeline, not a guarantee. Rebuilding our marriage would take more than apologies and promises, it would require patience, honesty, and the courage to confront the things we'd both buried for so long. Our relationship wasn't perfect before my mistake, but now it felt like we were walking on shattered glass. Every conversation, every interaction was tinged with unspoken tension. But even in the awkwardness, there was a glimmer of hope. Dr. Patel suggested we create rules of reconnection, boundaries and guidelines to help us navigate the process of healing. For James, it was about transparency. He wanted to know everything, where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing. At first, it felt invasive, but I understood his need for reassurance. I gave him access to my phone, my emails, and even my calendar. I'm not trying to control you, he said one evening. I just need to feel like there's nothing hidden anymore. I understand, I replied, and I meant it. Dr. Patel also encouraged us to focus on small moments of connection, simple acts that could help rebuild trust and intimacy. One evening, James and I sat down together after the kids were in bed. It wasn't planned, we just ended up in the living room at the same time. Do you remember our first date? He asked suddenly, his voice soft. I smiled, the memory flooding back. How could I forget? You spilled your drink all over the table. He chuckled, a genuine laugh that felt like a small victory. And you didn't run out the door, which I still don't understand. I thought you were charming, I said. His smile faded slightly, but there was warmth in his eyes. I miss that version of us, he admitted. Me too, I said, tears welling in my eyes. But maybe we can find it again. Our children were a constant reminder of what was at stake. Their laughter, their curiosity, their unshakable belief in the goodness of the world, they became our anchors, pulling us back to what mattered most. One afternoon, as we all played a board game together, James looked at me and said, "They deserve the best of us." They do, I agreed, my heart swelling with both guilt and determination. Rebuilding trust wasn't a straight line. There were moments when the progress we'd made seemed to unravel, like the time James caught me texting Mia late at night and assumed I was hiding something. "Who were you talking to?" he asked, his tone sharp. "It's just Mia," I said, showing him the message. We were talking about her upcoming trip. He relaxed, but the tension lingered. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. "It's hard not to jump to conclusions." "I get it," I replied. "And I'm willing to show you whatever you need to feel okay." His nod was small, but it felt like a step forward. A few months into our healing journey, James suggested we take a weekend trip, just the two of us. "We need to get away from everything," he said. "I think it'll help." We left the kids with my sister and drove to a quiet cabin in the mountains. At first, the silence between us was uncomfortable, but as the weekend went on, we began to relax. We went hiking, cooked meals together, and spent hours talking by the fire. On our last night, James said, "I've missed this, just being with you, without all the noise." "Me too," I said, reaching for his hand. The weekend away felt like a turning point, but it didn't erase the pain. Trust was still fragile, and there were days when it felt like we were treading water. But there were also days when I caught glimpses of the man who had once been my best friend, the partner I'd built a life with. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, James turned to me and said, "I don't know if I'm ready to say I've forgiven you. But I think I'm ready to try." His words brought tears to my eyes. "That's all I can ask for," I said. "Thank you." As we continued our journey, I realized that rebuilding our marriage wasn't just about repairing what was broken, it was about creating something new, something stronger. James and I began setting goals together, plans for the future that reminded us of what we were working toward. "It's not going to be easy," he said one evening. "But I think we're worth the effort." "I do too," I said, my heart full of gratitude. The days following James's tentative offer to forgive me marked the beginning of a new phase in our relationship. It wasn't a clean slate, there were still scars, still moments of doubt, but it was a foundation, something to build on. I clung to his words, "I think we're worth the effort," like a lifeline. Our life didn't return to normal immediately. It was more like we were creating a new normal, one that acknowledged the mistakes of the past while making room for growth. One of the most significant shifts was how we began to share the emotional load. Where once we had operated as parallel entities, each managing our own responsibilities without much overlap, we now started to approach challenges as a team. When our youngest had a meltdown over a forgotten school project, James stepped in before I could. He sat down with her, talking her through it patiently while I handled dinner. Later that night, I thanked him. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I wanted to," he replied simply. "We're in this together." His words reminded me that we were partners, even if the road had been rocky. Despite the lingering tension, there were moments of light, small instances where the weight of our struggles seemed to lift, even if just for a little while. One evening, as we cleared the dinner table, James made a joke about my tendency to leave the silverware in the sink instead of putting it in the dishwasher. "I think you're trying to sabotage my system," he said, a teasing smile on his face. I laughed, the sound catching me off guard. "I've been caught," I replied, playing along. It was a simple exchange, but it felt like a glimpse of the easy rapport we used to have. Of course, not every day was filled with laughter. There were still moments when the past reared its ugly head, testing the fragile trust we were rebuilding. One evening, as I scrolled through my phone, James glanced over and asked, "Who are you texting?" "Mia," I said, turning the screen toward him. "We're planning a girls' night." He nodded, but I could see the doubt flicker in his eyes. "I get it," I said gently. "You don't have to pretend it's easy." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not. But I'm trying. And I'm here for that," I said. A few months into our journey, James surprised me with tickets to a concert by one of my favorite bands. "I thought we could use a night out," he said, handing me the envelope. The gesture brought tears to my eyes, not because of the tickets, but because of what they represented. It was an effort to create new memories, to remind ourselves of the joy we could still find together. That night, as we stood in the crowd, swaying to the music, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in months. In our sessions with Dr. Patel, we continued to delve into the complexities of our relationship. One exercise she suggested was writing letters to each other, expressing the things we couldn't always say out loud. When I read James's letter, I was struck by his vulnerability. "I'm still angry," he wrote. "But I'm also still in love with the woman I married. I want to believe we can find our way back to each other, even if it takes time." His words brought me to tears, and when I handed him my letter, I could see the emotion in his eyes as he read it. "I don't expect you to forgive me easily," I'd written. "But I'm committed to earning your trust and being the partner you deserve. Through therapy and our own conversations, James and I began to see our relationship in a new light. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about understanding what had brought us to that breaking point in the first place. "We both let things slide," James said one evening. "I'm not saying that excuses what happened, but I wasn't as present as I should have been. And I didn't communicate how I was feeling," I admitted. "I let myself drift instead of reaching out to you." Acknowledging our shared responsibility didn't absolve me of my mistake, but it helped us see that our marriage was something we both had to nurture moving forward. Our children, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had shaken their parents' world, became a source of inspiration. Their laughter, their curiosity, their unshakable belief in love reminded us of what we were fighting for. One night, as I tucked our youngest into bed, she asked, "Why are you and Daddy so happy lately?" Her question caught me off guard, but it also filled me with a sense of hope. "Because we've been working really hard to be the best family we can be," I said, kissing her forehead. As the months turned into a year, James and I began to feel the shift. The cracks in our foundation hadn't disappeared, but they'd been filled with something stronger: honesty, vulnerability, and a shared determination to move forward. On our anniversary, James handed me a small, wrapped box. Inside was a bracelet engraved with the words, "Stronger Together." "I know it hasn't been easy," he said. "But I think we've built something even better than what we had before." I smiled through tears, slipping the bracelet onto my wrist. "Thank you for believing in us," I said. "For giving us another chance." Rebuilding a relationship after betrayal isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning from it, growing through it, and choosing each other every day. As I sit here reflecting on our journey, I'm filled with gratitude. Not just for James's willingness to forgive, but for the strength we found in ourselves and in each other. Our marriage isn't perfect, but it's real. And it's ours. A year after the night I confessed everything, James and I found ourselves in a place neither of us could have imagined when the storm first hit. Our marriage wasn't the same as it had been before, it was better. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real, honest, and built on a foundation of hard-earned trust. We had faced the darkest moments together, and somehow, we'd come out the other side stronger. But life, of course, didn't pause just because we'd found our footing again. New challenges arose, and with them came opportunities to prove to each other, and ourselves, that we were ready to face whatever came next. One day, James came home from work with an excited but nervous expression. "I got an offer," he said, setting his briefcase down on the kitchen counter. "An offer for what?" I asked, setting down the dish I was washing. "A promotion," he replied. "But it's in Chicago." The words hung in the air like a thundercloud. We had spent years building a life in this town, our friends, the kids' school, our routines. Moving to a new city felt like an enormous gamble, especially after everything we'd been through. But as we talked about it, I saw the spark in James's eyes, the excitement about the possibilities. And I realized that this wasn't just about his career, it was about our future. "We'll figure it out," I said, taking his hand. "Wherever we go, we'll do it together." The move to Chicago wasn't easy. Packing up our home was bittersweet, and saying goodbye to our friends was harder than I'd expected. But as we settled into our new house, I felt a sense of renewal, as if we were starting a new chapter not just geographically, but emotionally. The kids adjusted quickly, making friends at their new school and marveling at the sights of the big city. James threw himself into his new role, and I began exploring ways to build my own community, taking up volunteer work and joining local groups. Through it all, we leaned on each other, reminding ourselves that no matter where we were, our relationship was the constant that anchored us. One of the most surprising aspects of the move was how it gave James and me the chance to rediscover ourselves, not just as a couple, but as individuals. James found a renewed sense of purpose in his work, and I began pursuing creative projects I'd put on hold for years. "Do you think we would have done this if we hadn't gone through everything last year?" I asked him one night as we sat on our balcony, watching the city lights. Probably not, he admitted. I think we got too comfortable before. Too complacent. I nodded, his words resonating deeply. I guess sometimes it takes a storm to remind you how strong you are. Not every day was smooth sailing. One afternoon, James had to stay late at work for a meeting with a new client, a young woman whose name had come up in conversation a few times. As the hours ticked by, I felt a familiar pang of insecurity. When he finally came home, I couldn't hide the unease in my voice. How was the meeting? It was fine, he said, setting down his bag. Then he looked at me, his expression softening. You don't have to worry, Caroline. I know what that look means, and I promise you, there's nothing to worry about. His reassurance eased the tension, but it also reminded me how far we'd come, how much trust we'd rebuilt and how fragile it could still feel at times. To celebrate our first anniversary after the move, James surprised me with a weekend getaway to a small cabin by the lake. We've earned a little time to ourselves, he said with a smile. The trip was everything I didn't realize we needed. We spent our days hiking and our nights talking by the fire, reminiscing about the journey we'd been on and dreaming about what lay ahead. On our last night, James took my hand and said, "Thank you for sticking with me. For choosing us." "Thank you for believing in us," I replied, tears in my eyes. "For giving me another chance." As the months passed, life in Chicago began to feel like home. The challenges we faced no longer felt insurmountable, they felt like opportunities to grow. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching the kids play a board game, James turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "All the time," I said, smiling. "And I wouldn't trade it for anything." Our story isn't about perfection, it's about resilience. It's about learning from our mistakes, growing through our struggles, and choosing each other every single day. As I sit here, reflecting on the past year, I'm filled with gratitude. For the lessons we've learned, the life we've built, and the love that's stronger than ever. This isn't the end of our journey, it's just the beginning of a new chapter. A year and a half after the storm that nearly destroyed us, James and I stood in the middle of a life that looked nothing like the one we had before, and that was a good thing. Our move to Chicago, our renewed connection, and our commitment to healing had transformed not just our relationship, but how we approached life itself. This wasn't just about surviving a crisis anymore. It was about building a future that honored our past while embracing all the possibilities ahead. Our wedding anniversary arrived on a crisp fall day, and James surprised me by taking me to the first place we'd ever traveled together, a quaint bed and breakfast in a small lakeside town. As we walked along the shore, the cool breeze tangling my hair, he slipped his hand into mine. "I was scared we'd never get back to this," he admitted, his voice soft. "Me too," I said. "But I think we found something even better." That evening, we sat by a fire pit, toasting marshmallows and talking about everything we'd been through. "I don't think I realized how much I needed to forgive myself too," I said quietly. James looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "You've done the work, Caroline. We both have. And I'm proud of us." Our lives in Chicago had become a mix of new routines and cherished traditions. We found a favorite diner where the kids loved to order pancakes on Saturday mornings, a park where we spent lazy Sunday afternoons, and a cozy bookstore where James and I browsed for hours on rainy days. It was in those quiet, ordinary moments that I felt the most grateful. One evening, as we played cards with the kids at the dining table, our youngest said, "I love it when we're all together like this." Her words made James and me exchange a smile, a silent acknowledgement of how far we'd come. Life didn't stop throwing challenges our way, but we faced them as a team. When James's work became overwhelming, I picked up more at home. When I struggled to balance volunteering with parenting, James stepped in to lighten the load. One particularly tough week, James came home with takeout and a bouquet of daisies, my favorite. "I figured you could use a break," he said with a smile. It was a small gesture, but it reminded me of how much we'd grown. As our relationship stabilized, I began to think about the dreams I'd put on hold over the years. I'd always loved photography but had never pursued it seriously. James encouraged me to take the leap. "You've spent so much time supporting everyone else," he said. "It's time to do something for yourself." With his support, I started taking classes and eventually launched a small photography business. Capturing moments of joy and connection in others' lives became a way to honor the beauty I'd found in my own. One day, I came home to find a small envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was a handwritten note from James. "Caroline, every day, I'm reminded of how lucky I am to have you by my side. Thank you for your strength, your love, and your determination to build this life with me. I love you. Forever, James." The note brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't just the words, it was the thought, the care, the reminder of how far we'd come. As we marked 2 years since the events that tested us, James and I decided to write letters to each other. We sat on the couch one evening, reading them aloud, our words a testament to the resilience and love that had carried us through. "I never thought I could forgive," James wrote. "But what I've learned is that forgiveness isn't about erasing the pain, it's about choosing love in spite of it. And I choose you." My letter to him was equally heartfelt. "Thank you for giving me a second chance, for believing in us when I didn't think it was possible. You've shown me what love truly means. Our journey wasn't perfect, no journey ever is. But it was ours, and it was beautiful in its imperfection." As I sit here now, writing this, James is in the kitchen helping our youngest with a science project, his laughter echoing through the house. Our oldest is sprawled on the couch, reading a book, and the smell of fresh cookies fills the air. This is the life we've built, a life filled with love, resilience, and a commitment to showing up for each other every day. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that love isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about what you do after those mistakes, how you grow, how you heal, and how you choose each other in the face of it all. Our story is one of second chances, not just for our marriage, but for ourselves. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. This is the life we've created, and it's only the beginning.